Nothing is more absurd than that common and, alas, deeply ingrained conviction that there is no place for the mysterious and sinister in our everyday lives. Merely mention a patriarchal New England town, a clumsy rustic undertaker, and some incident in a burial vault, and the average reader is already primed for another harmless farce, perhaps tinged with grotesquerie. But, by God, this true story, from beginning to end, which I heard from the late George Birch, will afford little pleasure to lovers of light comedies and melodramas. Birch changed his occupation back in 1881, yet he always avoided speaking of what had happened and evaded the subject on any pretext. His old physician, Dr. Davis, who died several years ago, also kept silent. It was known to all that the cause of Birch's misfortune was a simple clumsiness, as a result of which he locked himself for 9 hours in the vault of the Valley of Peake Cemetery, escaping only through the most crude and destructive means. There is no doubt that this was indeed the case. Yet, more sinister circumstances accompanied that incident, which the victim himself recounted to me in drunken delirium shortly before his death. He likely trusted me because I was his attending physician. Perhaps he felt the need to confide in someone after Dr. Davis passed. He lived alone, without any family. Until 1881, Birch served as the undertaker in the Valley of Peake, standing out even among practitioners of that less than noble trade for his remarkable spiritual primitiveness. Much of what was said of him would seem unbelievable to a modern city dweller. Even the inhabitants of the Valley of Peake would have been disquieted to learn the nature of their mortician's moral code regarding the ownership of valuable burial ornaments concealed beneath coffin lids, or his adherence to common standards when placing silent clients into coffins that were far from precisely fitted. In short, Birch was callous and utterly unprincipled, though one could hardly call him evil or cruel. He was a typical idler and drunkard, devoid of even that small measure of imagination granted to every normal person. I do not know where to begin Birch's story. I am a poor narrator. Perhaps with December of 1880, which proved bitterly severe. The earth froze to a great depth, and the grave diggers, after conferring, decided to postpone digging until spring. Fortunately, the settlement was small, deaths were infrequent, and all the deceased found a place in temporary refuge, the single cemetery vault. With the onset of the severe cold, Birch sank into complete apathy. The coffins he cobbled together were even more misshapen than before, and as for the rusted lock on the vault door requiring occasional lubrication, Birch seemed to have forgotten entirely. At last, the spring thaw arrived, and activity in the cemetery resumed. Birch had always been irritated by the bother of reinterment, but he did not shirk his duties. On a certain gloomy April morning, he set to work. However, just before noon, a downpour commenced, forcing the undertaker to postpone his task, having committed to earth only one body, that of 9-year-old Darius Peake, whose grave was nearby. Birch intended to resume his labors the following day, beginning with old Fenner, whose resting place was also close by. But it turned out otherwise. His next attempt occurred only 3 days later, on Good Friday, the 15th of April. Not being superstitious, Birch attached no significance to the date at the time, yet from that day until the end of his life, he flatly refused to undertake any serious business on that fateful day. And so, on Friday afternoon, Birch harnessed his horse to the cart and set off toward the vault to transfer the body of Matthew Fenner. He was, as usual, in his cups, a fact he later admitted, though he had not yet begun to drink in the quantities that would later help him forget. His head was merely slightly dizzy, and he tugged the reins too often and too sharply, agitating his sensitive mare. No sooner had he roughly reined her in before the vault entrance than she began to neigh, stamp her hooves, and toss her head, much as she had that time, seemingly provoked by the pouring rain. The day was clear but windy, and upon swinging open the heavy iron door, Birch stepped inside with relief, sheltering from the elements. It is unlikely anyone else would have found pleasure in that damp, death-scented chamber with its 8 coffins arranged in disorder. But Birch was concerned with only one thing: lowering the right box into the right grave. He still remembered the scandal raised by Hannah Bixby's relatives when they discovered Judge Capwell's coffin beneath her headstone. Semi-darkness reigned within, but the undertaker had keen eyesight and did not mistake the coffin of Asaph Sawyer for Fenner's, though they were similar. That one, Sawyer's, had originally been fashioned for Matthew, but Birch had rejected it as unsightly and unsubstantial, a rare attack of scruple in so insensitive a man, perhaps prompted by the memory of how, 5 years prior, that diminutive old man had generously supported him on the brink of ruin. For Fenner's new coffin, Birch had employed all his skill, while the rejected box he saved and later used for Asaph Sawyer, who had died of a malignant fever. Sawyer was not much loved. Rumor spoke of him as a vengeful and vindictive man, capable of harboring a grudge over the slightest matter. Birch, without the slightest twinge of conscience, had consigned him to that carelessly made coffin, which he now kicked aside in his search for Fenner's. The door slammed shut with a gust of wind, just as Birch located old Matt's coffin. Everything plunged into darkness. The narrow transom admitted almost no light, and the ventilation shaft near the ceiling even less. Even for such an expert on the local terrain as Birch, the journey back to the door through the chaotically placed boxes took considerable time. Upon reaching it, he pulled at the loose handles for a long while, pushed his shoulder against the metal leaves, and wondered why the massive door had suddenly become so stubborn. Gradually, the truth of his situation dawned on him, and then he began to shriek wildly, as if the tethered horse outside could do more for him than answer with an indifferent whinny. The lock, neglected for years, had simply broken, and the careless undertaker found himself in a trap of his own making. This occurred, it seems, around 3:30 in the afternoon. Phlegmatic by temperament and pragmatic by nature, Birch soon quieted down and, falling silent, began searching for the tools he remembered lying in a corner. It is doubtful that the horror or absurdity of his position affected him much. Perhaps only the fact of confinement away from human haunts could disturb his equilibrium. His workday was hopelessly ruined. There was no hope of a chance passerby in these parts, so he was destined to sit there until morning at the very least. Finding a heap of tools in a recess, Birch selected a hammer and chisel and, stepping over coffins, returned to the door. The air in the vault grew heavier and more stifling, though this concerned Birch little as he concentrated on chiseling at the rusted, jammed mechanism. He would have given much now for a lantern or a candle stub, but in their absence he had to work blindly, convinced that such tools and such light would never suffice. The undertaker began to look around for other means of escape. The vault was dug into a hillside, and a narrow ventilation shaft ran through several feet of earth. There was no use thinking of that. His gaze lingered on the slit-like transom high in the brickwork above the door. It could be widened if one could but reach it. There was no ladder in the vault, and the burial niches in the rear and side walls were useless in this situation. Realizing that the coffins themselves would have to serve as steps, Birch began pondering how best to arrange them. To reach the transom, the height of 3 coffins would suffice, he reasoned, for would be more secure. Since the tops and bottoms of the boxes were relatively flat, they could be stacked like building blocks. It remained to devise how to construct a stable and climbable structure from the 8 available coffins. As he considered the possibilities, he could not help but lament that the components of his future edifice were so shoddily fashioned. In the end, Birch decided to place 3 coffins parallel to the wall at the base, set 2 rows of 2 coffins each upon them, and crown the whole with 1 more coffin to serve as a platform. This would allow him to ascend with minimal discomfort. Even better, he reasoned, to use only 2 coffins as the base. Thus, 1 coffin would remain in reserve and could be added to the top if greater height proved necessary. In the sinister twilight, the indefatigable prisoner shifted and stacked the boxes containing the relics of his neighbors, and his grim tower of Babel rose higher. From time to time, the decrepit coffins emitted ominous creaks, and Birch resolved to save the sturdily crafted coffin of Matthew Fenner for the very top, so that his feet might have the most secure footing possible. In the dark, he could find this coffin only by touch, and he did indeed stumble upon it almost by chance. It nearly fell into his arms after he awkwardly placed it beside another box in the 3rd tier. Having completed the structure and caught his breath on the lower tier, Birch took his tools and cautiously climbed to the top, finding himself directly opposite the narrow transom. It was framed by ordinary brickwork, and the undertaker had no doubt he would quickly widen the opening enough to squeeze through. The very first blows of his hammer elicited a subdued whinny from the horse outside. Whether approving or mocking, it was hard to say. Outside, darkness had long since fallen, but Birch kept hammering away. The seemingly fragile masonry proved stubborn. The moon vanished behind clouds. The work in the dark slowed, and its sluggish progress was his only consolation. He no longer doubted he would be free by midnight. Not a shadow of superstitious fear clouded his mind. Distracting himself from grim thoughts of time, place, and what lay beneath his feet, the undertaker chipped away at the bricks with philosophical composure, cursing when fragments struck his face and smirking with spiteful satisfaction if they hit the horse, which stamped its hoof impatiently on the other side of the wall. The hole gradually widened, and Birch began testing his fit. Beneath him, the coffins creaked and swayed precariously. He decided an additional box on top was unnecessary. The gap came right to his shoulders. It must have been past midnight when the opening seemed wide enough. Panting and drenched in sweat, Birch climbed back down and sat on the bottom coffin to gather strength for the final attempt. The horse neighed now without pause, a baleful note in its voice, and Birch inwardly wished it would drop dead. Strangely, the proximity of freedom brought him little joy. Moreover, he wasn't confident of success. His portly build was ill-suited for such exertions. Clambering back up the creaking boxes, he felt his own weight as never before, especially at the very top. The next moment brought the distinct crunch of splintering wood. Clearly, he had chosen the sturdiest coffin for his platform in vain. No sooner had he planted both feet upon it than the half-rotten lid gave way, and the undertaker plunged inside a good 2 feet. Startled by the crash, or perhaps by the scent that now escaped, the horse let out a sound scarcely recognizable as a neigh and bolted away, its cart clattering madly behind. But even apart from the revolting sensation of his legs sinking into the coffin, Birch could no longer simply reach the hole. Gripping the edges of the breach, he tried to pull himself up and then felt an inexplicable resistance, as though someone were dragging him downward by the ankles. For the first time that night, the undertaker felt fear. He strained with all his might, but could not break free from that tenacious, merciless grip. Suddenly, a monstrous pain shot through his calves, yet his indomitable materialism promptly supplied a saving explanation. Splinters, protruding nails, anything that might remain from the disintegrating box. The poor wretch may have screamed. At any rate, he kicked, writhed, and convulsed, hovering on the edge of unconsciousness. An eternity seemed to pass before Birch finally squeezed through the fissure and, with a heavy thud onto the damp earth, began to crawl away from the vault. He appeared utterly incapable of walking, and the moonlight, breaking through the clouds, illuminated a pitiable sight: a man with bloodied ankles, clawing convulsively at the grave soil as he dragged himself toward the caretaker's cottage. He struggled against the resistance of his own body, which moved with that maddening slowness familiar to anyone pursued in a nightmare. In reality, there were no pursuers when Armington, hearing a scrabbling at his door, flung it open. He was met by Birch alone, bloodied but alive. The master of the cottage helped him to a bed and immediately sent his young son for Dr. Davis. The unfortunate man was conscious but could utter only fragmented exclamations. "My legs! Let go!" The door slammed shut by itself. Then the doctor arrived with his bag and first set about removing the patient's clothing and shoes. The wounds revealed to his gaze. Both ankles near the Achilles tendons were literally mutilated, plunged him into consternation, if not horror. The questions he posed resembled an interrogation more than a medical examination. His hands trembled noticeably as he dressed the wounds, as if he were eager to hide them from sight. Of course, Davis, as an impartial physician, should not have questioned Birch so harshly, yet he seemed desperate to wring from the weakened undertaker every detail of his ordeal. With particular persistence, he inquired whether Birch was sure, and how precisely sure, whose coffin had been at the top. The doctor was interested in everything: how the box had been chosen, how he had managed to identify Fenner's coffin in the dark and distinguish it from the shoddy duplicate that held Asaph Sawyer. And how could it be that a stoutly crafted coffin had collapsed so easily? Davis, long practiced in those parts, had seen both coffins at their respective funerals. He had attended both Fenner and Sawyer until their deaths. And when Sawyer was laid to rest, Davis had never ceased to wonder how that short, yet by no means frail, man had fit into such a narrow box. The doctor departed only 2 hours later, instructing his patient to answer all questions about his wounds by saying he had been cut by nails and splinters. No one would believe any other explanation, he added, so it was best to keep quiet and certainly never show the wounds to another physician. Birch followed this advice for the rest of his life, until he told the story to me. And when I saw his scars, by then long healed and whitened, I could not but agree that silence had been a wise course. The tendons were torn, and he remained a cripple for life, but the heaviest injuries, I believe, were to his soul. His nerves were utterly shattered, and it was always pitiful to see him flinch at the accidental utterance of words like Friday, vault, coffin, and others with less obvious associations. His frightened horse returned to its stall that same night, which was more than could be said for his reason. He changed his occupation, but something continued to gnaw at him from within. Perhaps it was merely fear, or perhaps a belated remorse for his past callousness. His drinking, without a doubt, only intensified his torment, bringing no relief. That same night, having left Birch, the doctor armed himself with a lantern and set out for the old vault. The moonlight shone upon the disfigured facade and the fragments of brick. The heavy door opened easily. Hardened by years of work, Davis stepped resolutely inside, barely suppressing his nausea. He cried out once, then gasped hoarsely, a sound more terrible than any scream. Then he raced back to the cottage like a bullet, shook the patient awake, and, in a breaking whisper, poured out a torrent of words that shocked the wretched man. So I was right, Birch. It was Asap's coffin. I recognized the marks of his teeth in your legs at once. He was missing the front ones on top. For God's sake, never show those wounds. The body is nearly gone, but that expression, or rather, what's left of the face. You know what a beast he became when seeking revenge. Remember how he ruined old Raymond 30 years after their land dispute, and how he crushed the puppy that snapped at him last summer. He was a devil, Birch, and I think such monstrous malice could overcome both time and death. Good Lord, what hellish vengeance! I would not wish to be its target. But you, why did you do it, Birch? He was a scoundrel, and I don't blame you for the shoddy coffin, but, damn it all, this time you went too far. One can cut corners sometimes, but you knew what a short old man Fenner was. I shall never forget what I saw there till my dying day. You must have kicked desperately, because Asap's coffin is on the floor. The head is crushed, and there's terrible disorder all around. I have seen many things, but there was something there beyond all limits. An eye for an eye. As God is my witness, Birch, you got what you deserved. The skull nearly made me retch, but the other thing was worse still. The legs, they were severed clean at the ankles, so Asap's body could be forced into the coffin mint for Matthew Fenner. Ladies and gentlemen, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new stories. Share your impressions and thoughts in the comments. I would be delighted to chat with you.